welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, or my guest today is Michael Useem. Grace Under Pressure, for those of you who know the show, know we focus on the power of grace and how it can help us become more compassionate, more caring, and more committed to one another for good reasons. And when you do it as a leader, it means you bring people together for common cause and you energize them. It's such a privilege for me to have Michael Useem on the show today. I've known Michael for almost 20 years, and he has been kind and gracious to me. Mike, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
John, great to be here, and I appreciate your good words, and I return them. It's been a pleasure to know you over the last 20 years for many reasons, including this radio program.
Well, thank you. I want to tell folks about you. Mike is a professor of management and faculty director of the Leadership Center and the McNulty Leadership Program at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Mike's university teaching includes MBAs and non-executive MBA courses in management and leadership. And you also coach or teach in the exec ed programs and directly for companies. You're the author of many, many books. Top ones that I know of are Leadership Checklist, which I always recommend. Leadership Moments, one of my favorites because I love the leadership vignettes. And your newest book, which we're going to talk about today, The Edge, How 10 CEOs Learn to Lead and Lessons for All of Us. And Mike is a co-anchor of a weekly program through Wharton called Leadership in Action. And it's such a pleasure to have you, Mike. And I have to tell the folks a little story about you. You wrote a book called Leading Up, which inspired me to explore this topic. I explored it so well that when my book was published, I stole the title from you. You had the subtitle about Lead Your Boss, and that I directly took it, not intentionally, but it was in my subconscious. So I'm going to publicly apologize for you and thank you.
All right, John, no need for the apology, but I will offer a little bit of a story in exchange. When I sent the manuscript called Leading Up to my agent, I've long worked with a literary agent, he called me up and said, Mike, the proposal looks quite good. He said he was a little bit worried because he ran this agency with a number of people reporting to him. He said his own staff was exceptionally enthusiastic about leading up. So there it is. Okay, John.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, it's a wonderful topic, and it's not covered as much as it should be. So, Michael, what I enjoy about you is the way you approach leadership from so many different angles and so many different disciplines. So taking a quick step flash where we are today, what has our pandemic challenged leaders to be and to do?
Well, it's a great question, in part because that's what every leader of every kind and every place is thinking about, beginning last March in 2020, but certainly at the moment as well, as maybe a new wave is coming upon us. So leadership in COVID-19, maybe I'll sum it up this way, just kind of getting into the topic. What does it take to lead when life is really, really difficult, really uncertain, and kind of changing day by day around us? And I tend to focus in on three terrains. John, I lost you for a minute. Okay, we got you back. I tend to focus in on three leadership terrains in this moment. And by the way, this moment is it's not equivalent, but it's analogous to what happened after the global financial crisis back in 08-09. Everybody extremely damaged by the developments. Leadership becomes more vital in a period of uncertainty and change. That's true now too. And the three elements that I think, try this out, run it by your own filters, that make a real difference or are more called for than other times are, number one, thinking strategically, thinking by looking around corners, seeing signals coming in, appreciating that many people are looking at you, thinking strategically to sum that all up. Number two, deciding decisively. With the big issues upon it, are we masked? Should we be masked or maskless? Should we be in for a vaccine? Are workers allowed to come back, or are they required to come back if they're going to come back vaccinated? These are really enormously consequential decisions. Don't stall, make them now. Decisive decision making. Number three is remembering that so much of leadership is persuasion, talking with people about the vision, the strategy, where we're going, how we're going to get there, and thus communicating persuasively along with deciding decisively and thinking strategically, really, really important.
That's great. I love the strategic thinking. We talk about that a lot. And decisiveness, but I like your focus on that because I would bet that so many executives think, well, I'm decisive, but their people may not feel it. Do you observe that, Mike? So,
Yeah, I think, yes. Life is filled with, let's call it paradoxes. Somebody says, I'm a great leader, and they're not.
yeah.
I'm the smartest person in the room, but maybe I'm not. And I think the same thing is true of becoming a decisive decision maker. Thus, external benchmarks are very useful. So, coaching and mentoring, what you do, John, as part of who you are, becomes really important because we can decide we're a decisive decision maker or an extremely persuasive communicator, but double checking that against what our mentor says, or maybe our coach offers up, or others note about us in print, or maybe in anonymous 360 feedbacks. Check yourself out against the external metrics, I guess is my summary.
You got, or our spouses too.
Check it out at home. Totally. Your partner's important here.
The reason you saw me disappear for a moment was I wanted to get a copy of your book, which I have, The Edge, and how 10 CEOs learn to lead and lessons for all of us. And before we jump right into it, but it's germane to this book, you, and I mentioned this earlier, you have been studying leadership from so many different disciplines, the arts, academics, and business, whereas so many management books focus strictly on business, and that's fine. But I love your overall view. So what leads you to explore leadership from different disciplines?
So I think two reasons behind this commitment to look at leadership in all of its guises and all of its terrains. The first is we often, I think this is true, test this out, John, and get it to your own thinking. We often learn as much about ourselves by looking far away from ourselves as close in. Thus, we have looked over the years at the U.S. Armed Forces. What can we learn that they do that got nothing directly relevant, say, to trading on Wall Street or running a consulting firm, but nonetheless at a deeper level can be helpful. And often, by looking away from home, we are more persuaded of what is important at home because we're seeing it over there, it makes sense over there. Commander's Intent, a great example. We can come back on that. And thus, it's been very helpful in thinking about leadership, teaching leadership, which I'm involved in extensively, to look away from home and see better what is at home. Number two, though, equally important, is that in looking for some of the better ideas on how to lead, the emergent practices on how to get things done, they're everywhere. We just got to look out there for them. So for example, we've looked at sports extensively for what an NBA player or coach might be coming up with for leading the team on the court. We've spent a good bit of time with the military academy, West Point, the U.S. Military School at West Point, Military Academy, the Naval Academy at Annapolis. We've worked extensively with the Marine Corps in its base at Quantico, Virginia. And there are just many ideas that people in business have never thought about that they've thought about going back to over 200 years ago. So anyway, for those reasons, look out there. There's some great ideas that can help us inside right here.
Right. And what I like about you've been doing this longer than anyone I know. I mean, and I know Peter Drucker, of course, folks, that's on that. But for a practitioner in right now, you've been doing this for quite some time. So anyway, so The Edge, what led you to write it, Mike?
So two factors behind or kind of two drivers, two motivators behind the decision to look at 10 chief executives and how they're leading now, how they've learned to lead now, especially in ways that are different from 5 years ago or maybe 10 years ago. I've always loved the phrase, it's not my own. It comes from Marshall Goldsmith, a coach that most people know the name of if you haven't worked with him. What got you here won't get you there. For him, it's more of a focus on the individual. What got you to your current position is going to require some redoing on your part to get to your next position. I take that at a company level to be this. The leadership at the top, not just the top executives, but all the way through the middle and frontline ranks, the way they led, let's say 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right after the internet bubble burst, is probably not going to serve you well in the next 10 years. And thus, I, as a teacher of leadership, or as the way we put it, I don't teach leadership, I help people learn leadership. I'll personalize this. I'm going to make a grave mistake if I'm helping people in a classroom or programs, the kind that you and I both are involved in, learn what guided leadership in 2015. We need to reference that, but we also need to know what's going to be vital in the year 2025. The second reason, though, equally important for moving in this direction, is I took a look at a few statistics that float out there. For example, how long have companies been listed in the Fortune 500 or the S&P 500? S&P 500, America's 500 largest companies by market value. And the half-life, if I can borrow that term from physics, of a company in the Fortune 500 50 years ago was more than half a century. So if you got into the Fortune 500 and made that issue, you're going to probably be there for the next 50 years. Today, it's down to 15 years. So it just on the face of it says those companies that apparently were well led when they got up under the Fortune 500, somehow the leadership thereof, think Kodak, think Blockbuster, somehow their leadership not, yeah. So somehow their leadership could not make the pivot to learn to lead in a new era, which is always essential and maybe even more so given what's been happening to the turnover in the Fortune 500.
Right. And that, I think, leads to the theme of your book, and you say it, find your edge. What does that mean in the context of leadership, and in this book in particular?
Well, let's personalize it for people viewing or listening to the program. Let's say your boss calls you up and says you are hereby promoted to some much more significant role within the enterprise or the community group, or maybe even a hospital or a school. And the first question, or maybe the second question, besides telling your partner that you've got a big promotion, is to ask yourself, as you take on this larger role, maybe the one that your boss just had, are you ready to lead in your own way and in your own time? So look at your boss, remember how she or he has led, but don't let that limit your horizons, because almost unequivocally, the next 5 years, you're going to have to lead differently. And just to make the case with an illustration, one of the individuals I promote or I bring into the book is the now former chief executive at Vanguard Group, one of America's largest asset managers. Last time I looked, it was over $6 trillion under management at Vanguard Group. It's right up there with BlackRock and with Fidelity and State Street. His name is Bill McNabb, served for a decade, and he said as he took the CEOship of Vanguard, now about a dozen years back, he followed two great predecessors. One is the famous Jack Bogle, and Jack Bogle was followed by Jack Brennan. Both did a great job in their own times. Bill McNabb said, I've learned a lot from them, but I understand kind of the edge. I'm looking at a new era, changing issues about investment management, and I've got to develop my own additional method for leading, and that is the edge. You've got to get yourself to the edge of where the world's going.
I want to stop you there, right? Because it's such a good thought. And you mentioned Bill McNabb, who followed two legendary leaders. So
Indeed.
when he understood that he had to lead in his time and place for where he was going, how did the board react to that? So, did they?
It's a really interesting question because ultimately everybody reports to somebody.
Yeah.
And in the private sector, it tends to be a board of directors. Vanguard's very much in that tradition.
I can just hear them go, it's good enough for John Bogle or Mr. Brennan. What makes you think you're going to change it? I'm just being the voice of skepticism.
Totally. Well, and the response would be, and directors should be open to this, that investors are thinking differently this year than they were 5 years ago. And to make it that very specific, it's historically kind of contained in the moment. Bill McNabb took over Vanguard not long before the global financial crisis hit, just after Lehman failed in September '08. And
timing is everything.
Well, and the board didn't need a lot of convincing that what's going to happen now just has to be done differently from a period of amazing growth. So hopefully your directors are ready to hear your arguments. They'll be sharp-minded about whether it's a compelling argument, but hear your arguments. Look, I've got to put this company together in a different fashion. For example, ETFs, exchange-traded funds, were barely around when Bill McNabb took over. But pretty quickly, they were already coming to the fore, but pretty quickly he figured, look, we've got to be innovative. We've done what we've done the way we've done for many years, beginning with Jack Bogle's founding of the firm. But I actually have to build a staff that understands how exchange-traded funds work. We have to provide those as part of our menu. So it's a quick summary, though, to sum up the main point. This is something you need to negotiate with your boss, how you're going to lead differently, and or your board.
And thank you for saying that, because that opens up the whole idea of so many good leaders I know you've profiled or spoken about, and I've done the same thing, and they're legends. But I think a gift they give, part of their legacy is they go to their successor and say, look at what I did, but do it your way. Do you see that, Mike?
I see it sometimes, but boy, that
would
be the statement. You're in charge now. It's up to you to plot your way forward. What got me here, what got you here is not what's going to provide you with the leadership you need in the next, make it five to 10 years ahead. And the example I actually begin the book with, kind of a reverse expression, but it's the same point. Howard Schultz stepped down at Starbucks a while back, and his very able successor came in with different ideas. No surprise, he's a different person. It's a different era. And at one point, a little bit frustrated with what he was experiencing, that the successor was experiencing at Starbucks, he came into a meeting and said, I just want to tell you, you the board or you the top management team, I'm not Howard Schultz. I'm going to propose different ideas. It's a different era. People want coffee for different reasons. Stores are going to operate on different principles. And I should understand the heritage I have, but I'm going to make a grave mistake if I'm a carbon copy of the predecessor.
No, that's good. And he had to do what he did. But I think, didn't Mr. Schultz come back?
Not in this case. This is the person who stayed on.
Oh, okay. That's good. Okay, good. You have in your chapter, and I found it fascinating, called the chapter I'm referring to is called Mastering the Field. And there's a concept, team of teams, which Stanley McChrystal, who's a general and worked in Afghanistan and led our forces there, pioneered. What does it mean, team of teams?
Well, for starters, it's a great phrase which captures what are sometimes more abstractly, by academics anyway, described as the architecture of the firm. So as we think about a firm that's more than 50 people, maybe even a couple hundred, or in the case of Amazon these days, more than 1 million, we divide people up into groups and into silos. And as you begin to work your way up the leadership hierarchy, as you get more responsibility, you're not going to be leading directly 500 people as a flat pyramid, 500 people reporting to you. You've got sub teams, functional and divisional teams, but leadership at that somewhat higher level entails not only making certain teams are fantastically motivated, they understand what they need to do, they're technically adept, but we've got to put the teams together. Thus, a team of teams. It's a great reminder. It's so well spelled out in Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, that leadership does not stop with leading your own direct reports. You've got to think about the several teams maybe that report to you. If you, for example, are the responsible service person in Afghanistan, and that's a higher art. Somehow we have to make certain that marketing connects with engineering, or that the people operating in sales in India can work with those who are working in Brazil, or with the suppliers of the products that they are selling. So leadership is very individual. When we begin our career, it's about you and John and myself speaking to maybe 5 or 10 people. Very personal. We need to know their names, need to know who they are, need to let them know where we're going. But as we become a leader of leaders, a leader of teams, we have to think about it as a team of teams. And that requires us to think holistically about the architecture and also the culture that makes ultimately larger enterprise and very small ones get to their edge.
And I think getting back to your point about the three things: strategic leadership, forgetting point number two, but the third one was persuasion. And, well, when you're working in a team of teams or large organizations, as you said, marketing and logistics and working overseas, people need to know the purpose, the vision, and why we do what we do. And that's a relentless job of communication. Would you agree with that, Mike?
Yes, I would agree with that. And it begins in its simplest form, what we all have to master. We have to be able to walk into a room and be persuasive. We have to communicate our character. We have to acknowledge what's on people's minds. We really got to work the room. That said, when that room becomes too big, or the number of people is too big for the room, I'll put it that way, we then have to draw on additional methods. And it's for that reason that I do a profile in the book of the current chief executive at Johnson & Johnson. So he, Alex Orsky is his name, came up through the organization, began as a frontline salesperson with 0 people reporting to him. So he began as a detail person, as they would have been called in the era, selling hardware that J&J made for surgeons. So he would call up a surgeon and say, look, I'd like to talk with you about our great products. He's moved up, and today he's got about 140,000 people reporting to him. On the way, in the early days, he could sit down with the 6 people reporting to him and say, here's the deal, everybody. Here's our pricing. Here's our method. Here's our commitment to the firm and shareholder value and all of that. But today, he has to communicate to 140,000 people, and therefore other devices, especially the statement of purpose, the cultural values you create, become critical. And that's, as I profile it now in this one chapter on Alex Orsky and J&J, that has become his edge, which is to shape the fluids that we swim in without quite realizing that it's there. It helps guide us to get from here to there. Call it the culture. In this case, at J&J, they embody it what they call the credo. But to get back to the main point, communicating persuasively is vital. Early in your career, it's one-on-one. Later in your career, we have to use other methods, including sustaining the culture in meaningful ways.
Right. Now, getting to this is part of the loneliness at the top, something that Marshall Goldsmith talks a lot about. And you have something in here about doubt. And I've always thought that doubt is kind of a self-check on our arrogance. And you talk about George Washington and doubt. So tell us about that. So,
Well, it's an odd person to include in a book on contemporary chief executives, in that as I mentioned, I've profiled the CEO of Johnson and Johnson and DuPont and Progressive Insurance, Estee Lauder companies, and so on. But George Washington and his own life's work was so compelling to me that I opted to make that a final closing chapter around this point. And that is, if we take our current moment, 2021, July or so, 2021, and we recognize we're really good at leading, but we're going to have to be different, probably want to get better. Our obligation, whatever our age is to not necessarily doubt, but remember that we've got a lot of learning yet to go. And that said, this really does describe George Washington's own ascent to become the commanding officer of the Continental Army. I think most of those taking in the show will recall the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia with the Declaration of Independence. Just not long before that, decided to appoint George Washington as the commanding officer of the newly formed Continental Army, which was sort of a left out at that point, a leftover ragtag group of Minutemen from the Boston region who had assembled to push the British back from Lexington and Concord. As he departed Philadelphia for his destiny in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, he wrote a couple letters saying, I don't know what I'm getting into. I don't think I've got the capability. And there's a lot of truth to the statement if you step back from it. He had served in the British Army for a little over 5 years, some years earlier, dropped out of school when he was in fourth grade, did not have the 20 years of service that those who serve the United States now will have before they would become a general officer. And he was on his way to Cambridge to become the general officer for an army that was going to push back against the world's largest, strongest, and most powerful army of the era, the British Army. So he expressed doubts. Having said that, he addressed the doubts. He says, I have a destiny, I have a calling, I need to lead, I've been asked to lead. And as doubtful as I am about what I don't know on how to become a commanding officer for the Continental Army, I am determined to learn. And that's the whole point of the final chapter of the book, is to help people remember that as you move up, taking new responsibilities, as you move forward and have to lead things differently, that your learning curve is still in that upward direction. You've got a ways to go. Don't get shy about it. Have doubts, but indeed step forward and make a difference.
Without question. And part of that doubt comes from a sense of humility and understanding, acknowledging one's own limitations, which is not weakness, I would believe, and I argue it's a form of strength. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And John, just a quick comment on that, and I'm sure in your coaching you've passed this along too, and I know it's in some of your books. How do we think strategically, or how do we learn how to think strategically? Well, a really good method is by just keeping your ears open, your ear to the ground, asking people who are maybe in your China operation, so what's up in China? I know a lot about it. I read The Economist. I talk with people in Washington. But the act of listening cannot be overstated for its avenue to become a more effective leader in ways that you haven't seen before.
and that's a great point because leaders as executives are the one thing they don't have is the luxury of time, and they're pushed and pulled 24/7. The higher up they go, you're always on. And so just what you said, asking questions, reading, so often the tendency, the pushback when I talk is, well, I don't have time to do that. Well, you don't have time not to do it. And I think the intention,
Yep.
and that's a good point. So.
Well, it's a really important point, just to underscore what you've just said. That does require time. So don't underestimate how much time it does take to get out of the office, to spend time with the frontline people in California or maybe Brazil. And the example around which I developed that point in the book is of the chief executive of a large regional bank here on the East Coast, called or abbreviated. The four letters are WSFS. WSFS. It's a bank that uh, investors or borrowers or bank account holders in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey will know. WSFS Bank. Its CEO, its chief executive, a person named Mark Turner, came to appreciate, like we all do, that financial technologies, fintech for short, were going to change how his bank should operate. He just didn't know exactly how or when or how much demand there would be for purely online access to accounts versus talking to your personal banker. So, speaking of time, he requested permission from his board, and it was given, to go on what he called a learning tour, a learning tour. And he literally took off 3 months, went to nearly 50 companies, including Walmart and Apple, not in banking, but facing, in one case, making some of the devices for financial technology application. In the other case, Walmart looking to digify all that it's doing, with Amazon coming hard on. So, with all that said, Mark Turner took a leave. He told the number two person, "You're it for 3 months. Don't call me unless it's absolutely essential." And he did a learning tour and came back a changed person. He understood actually two very important elements. Number one, he came to realize that his number two was ready to become number one. Number two was made acting CEO for those 3 months, did a great job. And this became a compelling case then for the CEO to move on and bring his number two up into the number one position. Equally, he learned how financial technologies were changing the world or not in ways that he brought back to the bank. For instance, a younger generation, they don't want to talk to a banker as much as wonderful it is to talk to your favorite banker. They want to go online, open an account in 30 seconds, and get a loan for a couple $1,000s in 5 minutes. However, Mark Turner learned that many people, maybe yours truly included, sometimes like to walk into a branch office and sit down with a banker and just give you some guidance. All that said, it was a listening tour, a learning tour. And so, back to your point, time is short, but this is a great area to be investing in if you want to think strategically.
Great. Well, one thing, time is racing by, and I forgot to check with you, but do you? And I ask all of our guests a story about grace, and I think you just told us one about the gentleman the executive who was savvy enough to recognize the talent beneath him was so good, but had this act of humility of just going out and listening, and you're saying the determination to learn. Is there anything else you want to add on that, Michael?
Yeah, there's a part two to it. And again, to make the case, I've profiled still a different top executive to make the case. I find that in the classroom or when I write, that certainly I and hopefully my students and the readers can better appreciate these more general statements if they can see the statements anchored in what somebody has done or somebody, maybe many people working together have achieved. So the case I would focus on, or the illustration I would focus on here, is of the person who runs Progressive, it's called Progressive Corporation. Most of us know it as Progressive Insurance. Flo, the actor and comedian who's represented Progressive for more than a decade, is sort of the face, at least on television, of
You mean
Progressive.
she's not the CEO? No.
No, she literally is a professional actor and a professional comedian. So they got the right person for all that. The chief executive, the CEO, is a person named Patricia Griffith, Trish Griffith for short, and she has added a second element So active listening, unequivocally more important now than in the era, let's say, of Jack Welch, where the big boss would observe and then declare, and everybody would salute. It's a bit of an overstatement, but I think we got the gist of that. Tricia Griffith is of the new school, and that is the big boss concept, maybe right for the 1990s. Jack Welch stepped down at the end of that decade at GE, but it's unequivocally not right for this decade. This is her edge. People don't no longer, a new generation no longer wants to imagine in a very high tower a remote CEO who hands down edicts. They're suspicious. They want to see the person out there as a person. And Tricia Griffith has absorbed that message by, with her 40,000 people, being the opposite of the big boss. Case in point, she walked me from point A to point B when I was out to see her office and her in Cleveland, which is where they're located, outside of Cleveland. And she said, "We're going to walk the staircase. We're taking no elevator." I said, "Really? Why is that?" And she says, "I never take the elevator. I always walk the staircase or down a hallway by myself. That's how I keep in touch with hundreds or even thousands of the people that I work with." And maybe the extreme case in point, to add the color, on Halloween every year, it's a holiday within the firm. Imagine the chief executive of your dressing up as Captain Marvel, as she does, and walking around the firm. But that's exactly what she does. And many people, thousands now, have met her. And so when she does offer policy changes and how Progressive is going to pursue its customers, they're thinking, "Oh yeah, I saw her as Captain Marvel last week. We chatted in the cafeteria." So she's the antithesis of the big boss. Does it pay off? I think it does. In that 2 years ago, Fortune magazine, that always names the CEO of the year from one of the best performing of the Fortune 500 firms, it did name Tricia Griffith as the Fortune magazine CEO of the year, in part because she got great results, and in part because she illustrated the new methods of leading. She was at her own edge, and I think it's going to be the edge in years to come. Be accessible, get out of that high tower, and meet everybody and listen to them.
That's great. Mike, it's been such a pleasure to meet you. I will put the notes for how people can reach you. The book is The Edge, and it's available wherever. This is where I fail. The Edge. It's available wherever books are sold, and I highly recommend it because it's a treat. And Mike, I'll say a closing note. You have taught me much, and I am in your debt, my friend. So it's an honor to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you, John. I'll say the same for you. I've learned so much from you. I appreciate being on the show. We will stay in touch, and may you and I both stay somewhere close to the edge.
Okay, good. And with that, we'll close out. So.
All right. Thank you, John.